On this edition of the Table of Content, we review The Angel's Door, a short story recorded by We Are One Body Audio Theater. We look at the life of Saint Zita captured in this story. Stay tuned, that's coming up next, right here on the Table of Content. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the Table of Content. I am Albert Saenz, joined with my co-host, Mike Timmons. Mike, how are you doing?
I am doing great. Thanks, Albert. How are you?
Pretty super, pretty well, pretty good, all things positive. So I'll take it. So for those of you who do not know, Mike Timmons is one of the volunteers with We Are One Body Audio Theater. So we're glad to have him on board for this edition of the Table of Content. But let's get right into it. Now, I have a question first. Yes. Mike, you're pretty familiar with the saints through some of your own work. Are you familiar with Saint Zita? Is she one of the saints you're familiar with?
Somewhat, yes. I draw saints for Catholic newspapers and such. And Saint Zita is one of the saints that I have drawn before. I don't know a whole lot. There's just snippets of information I know. I think she was like a maid.
Right. That's what I gather. Right. She was sort of like a lifelong servant or maid.
Yes.
So we have this story, and this is one of the saint stories by Christopher Reibold, known to some as the Saint Guy or the Saint Story Guy, I believe. So we've recorded a lot of his stories, and this one's fun. We basically have Zita, who through the story is portrayed as a young girl, and going out for what I believe is Christmas Eve Mass, and it's cold, and she's kind of running late, but she has an encounter along the way. You wanna take over there as far as what happens next in the story?
Yeah, so she's running late to midnight mass, something that she obviously is looking forward to, and she's about to walk into the door, and she almost trips over a poor beggar who is desperately cold, and she received a cloak from who's the woman? Mrs. Fatinelli. I guess that's
right.
The woman she works for.
Right, Mrs. Fatinelli.
Right, and Mrs. Fatinelli, I don't know much about the saint, but it sounds to me like she's not the nicest person to work for.
Yeah, she gives the impression that she's a little rough around the edges.
Right. So it takes a lot of courage for Zita. She gives up her cloak and says, after mass, I need this back, basically, because this isn't mine really to give away. But yeah, so the mass is beautiful, and she's like on cloud 9. The joy of Christmas is in her heart.
Oh sure.
But as she's walking out, the baker's not there anymore, and you almost sense like all that joy, all that peace is like dissipated, and she's kind of wondering what's going to happen when Mrs. Fatinelli finds out.
And you know what I like in the story transition here, right? Because it was already said it was kind of a cold night, but then so now she doesn't have the cloak, which was gifted to her for the night from Mrs. Fatinelli. But then she goes back, it's cold, it's starting to snow, it's blustery, her hair apparently gets wet. And then she gets back and she has to work all night baking bread for the next day. So the story kind of seems to sort of take this sort of downward spiral for poor little Zita, only to sort of have to face the consequences the next morning.
Yes. Yeah, she doesn't get any sleep. She's making bread the entire night, and morning happens, and Mrs. Fatinelli, Mr. Fatinelli come down the stairs Christmas morning, and Zita is just, I cannot imagine what's going through her mind. Like, this cloak was given to her as, basically she was told, don't lose any buttons, don't get any blemishes on it, such and such. She doesn't even have the cloak at this point. And right when she's about to confess, there's a knock upon the door.
Right.
It's like perfect timing.
I know. Great. I gotta jump in there because
Yeah.
you talked about that having to face sort of the music, having to go and sort of confess that she does not have the cloak, and I remember that feeling. I remember that feeling as a child,
Mm,
having to sort of confess, being confronted with the thing that you did that you weren't supposed to do, and
right.
it's an awful sinking sort of a feeling that it sort of runs through your body when you have to face those moments. So
Mm,
I'm sure Zita, even though obviously we can already learn from her that she has a disposition towards charity and helping those in need, that she's still a child who's like, oh gosh, I got to go tell Mrs. Fatinelli that I don't have her cloak anymore.
mm, yeah. And like I said, there's a knock upon the door, and a man shows up, and it was the baker, and he gives the cloak back. And you could just imagine like the relief, and also, I guess when I read it, I was sort of like who was this guy? You know,
Right, right,
and did he
right.
know? How did he know where they lived? And it seems as the story progresses, as the story concludes, it's basically assumed or presumed that this was an angel of God all along. Was it? I don't know. I'm guessing this is based on a true story. Do you know?
Sure. Well, I believe that that Christopher Reibold has sort of based his stories off of sort of the legends of the different
Right.
saints. So more or less, it's something that has been similar to what's happened in the saint's life. Is it
Hmm.
an account? I don't think it's an exact account, but it's a close representation
Yes.
of this particular saint, Saint Zita.
Yes, and what a story it is. I mean, part of me was a little bit. I'll be honest. The first time I read it, I'm like, okay, is this it? Like, she sees a beggar, gives the cloak. Beggar disappears. Beggar comes back. It's assumed he's an angel. But as I was reading it more and more in detail, it is actually very beautiful, and there's a lot of deeper things going on, such as the circumstances, the day this took place, which was Christmas, the day when Christ, not to get too theological here, but
Sure, sure.
he, in a sense, took on our poverty, just as Zita experienced the coldness of that night, and then we were clothed in his divinity, um, which is really beautiful. And part of me was, this is sort of my own imagination going, but is it possible? I mean, sure Christopher Reibold would be open to this, but the angel of God perhaps was gathering that cloak, um, in a sense, to give it to the Christ child on that cold day that Jesus was born.
Sure,
And
sure.
this small act of charity, first from Mrs. Fatinelli to give the cloak to Zita, Zita to give the cloak to this beggar, and then in my own imagination, this beggar that Christmas night giving that to baby Jesus. It's just, I mean, all around, it's a story for Christmas for sure.
Oh, most definitely. It is a good story, and of course, as we get closer towards celebrating the Christmas season, it's a good story to sort of remind us about the importance of giving rather than receiving. And I liked what you said about Christ sort of coming down to us as the child, as sort of into our poverty, our human poverty. And then ultimately, what does he do at the end of his life, or through his
Mm,
public ministry at the end of his life? He gives everything for us
mm,
and doesn't ask anything in return. And what do we see out of Zita? A child in some sort of, I assume, poverty situation. She's having to work for this family, and spends the rest of her days working as a maid, as a servant to the family. But then she doesn't have much. All she has is what was given to her, and then she just gives it over freely to
mm,
this beggar. Much like Christ gives everything to those who are in need. And of course gave his life. And then Zita continues to give. It could have just been the end of the story, but she goes back and she has to stay up and she has to keep working. She could have just gone to her room upset and, said, well, I'm too upset to work. But no, she continues to give of herself. She continues to hold up to her responsibility, her work. And, she makes it through the night, bleary-eyed and, full of tears, about to confess, all right, I'm going to continue to give. I'm going to sacrifice myself, because it is a sacrifice when you give yourself up and say, hey, I did this, and I give myself now for the consequences. Christ gave himself over freely for the consequences that awaited him in his passion, right? So we see Zita really sort of representing what we all kind of should be doing, not just during the Christmas season, but throughout our entire lives. So I think Zita comes out as a really great example of how to live our lives.
Right. I mean, that's why she's a saint, I suppose. She emulates the virtues of what we all should be doing. And especially during Christmas time, we're always reminded of it's a season of giving. And in a sense, I always thought that was cheesy in a way. Christmas is about Jesus's birth. It's not just giving. But there is a lot of truth to that, because what is it about giving that just, you can see it in Zita's life. She was free. She had to walk home. She knew that. She knew there was a risk here. But in giving, when she saw the beggar, like, all that sort of dissipated, and those worries were washed away. And you can see it also in Mr. Fatinelli. As he's looking for the beggar on that cold morning, he's outside and he doesn't even realize he's in the cold because he saw a miracle. And I think there's something beautiful about that. Like, Mr. and Mrs. Fatinelli experienced maybe a new way of looking at the world, which Zita had all along, and that is through the lens of giving, the lens of charity, the lens of Christmas.
And it would be good for us all to sort of have that lens on, to have the lens that Mr. and Mrs. Fatinelli see through after they experience this sort of Christmas miracle that's depicted in the story. What was it, an angel? Was it, Christ himself as a beggar? It doesn't matter, because it's, what does Christ say, right? Whenever you helped the least of my brothers, the least of my people, you helped me. So whoever the beggar represented, it was Christ. It was right. Christ that Zita was helping. It was Christ that, through this miracle that Mr. Fatinelli and Mrs. Fatinelli were able to sort of experience what happens when we give ourselves and we sort of give back to Christ through our charitable acts. And it doesn't even stop with Mr. Fatinelli and Mrs. Fatinelli. What does the end of the story say? It says, soon everyone in the little Tuscan town of Lucca had heard the story of Zita, the angel, and the cloak. So it went beyond, it went beyond just that house. And that's sort of, that's Christ. The light of Christ can be shared through the simplest of means. And in this particular story, shared through the kind act of a small child, who was just a servant. And probably no one would have given any consideration to. But through this small child, and obviously through the rest of, like you said, there's a reason that she's a saint. So through the rest of her life, I am sure was full of a heart of charity and wanting to give back, because that's what she wanted to do. That's what she loved. She loved Christ, and she wanted to be as good as she could for Christ in her life.
To this day, the story is told every Christmas in that part of Italy. That's fascinating. Like I said, the first time I read it, I was like, okay, I don't know. On first look, it wasn't that impressive of a plot, but the more you see it, the more it's simple, but it's very profound and very beautiful. And have you ever heard the song, What If He's an Angel? It's a country song.
I'm not going to try and sing it, but I think I know which one you're talking about.
It totally reminded me of that in a sense. That's this story, making it to Hollywood, to big time. It's that reminder that that person on the street, that the couple arguing in the apartment. The song says, "What if they're angels sent from heaven, making certain that we're doing our best to take the time to help one another." Anyway.
Yes, sing it. Sing it.
So, yeah, are they angels? Like you said, it doesn't really matter. Christ said, "What you do for the least of these, you do for me." And that it couldn't be more spot on. Like, yes, anytime there's a person in need, such as this beggar, such as that man on the side of the road, that is, when we're called to be like Zita, to be like Christ. And what amazes me about Zita is that this wasn't her cloak. It was given to her to borrow, and she gave it to someone else who needed it even more. And when we see that poor person on the side of the road, when we see that person in need, let's remember that the thing that we're called to give them isn't even like ours. It was like, whether it's money, this was something that, God has given to us to share. Or whether it's, food or just our time, like, this is all stuff that has been generously given to us by God so we can give to another. And it's like the scripture passage, "Be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful." Like, give and forgive just as God gives and forgives to us.
Well said. I completely agree with that point, that all that we have has been gifted to us, and it is up to us to give that back to those in need. And God will give it back. God will pay us back tenfold, but we have to be courageous enough to give and to have that heart of charity to give back all that has been given to us in order to serve, as you said, the least of those around us. So no, I really appreciate you making that point. But I think that's really a great place to wrap up on. So ladies and gentlemen, what's the takeaway here from the Angel's Door? It's charity, kindness, and to give of ourselves, and especially
it's the Christmas spirit.
Yeah, the Christmas spirit, right? Let's not be Uncle Scrooges. Let's be the opposite, and let's give of all that we have to help those around us. So, and if you haven't listened to this story, you can find it on our website or our YouTube page. Look up for We Are One Body Audio Theater. And again, the story is The Angel's Door by Christopher Reibold. So I invite you to listen to it, share it, maybe learn more about the life of Saint Zita, and find the ways in your life how you can give. Hey, Mike, thanks so much for joining me for this episode. Really great to have you on board. Thanks for helping us.
Oh, my pleasure. This was fun.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. And until the next time, be good, stay safe. Peace.